Welcome to Still Unanswered. I'm Maya Ellison. Tonight, we return to a case that has haunted Chapel Hill for years, the life and killing of Faith Hedgepeth. This episode is somber, it's careful, and I want to be clear from the start, we are talking about a murder that remains, in many ways, unresolved. There is an accused man in custody, but the full story of what happened the morning Faith died, who was there, and why, those questions still hang. With me is Dr. Leela Redbird. Leela, thank you for being here.
Thanks, Maya. I'm glad to be here. This case, it's one I've followed not just as a scholar, but as a member of a community that keeps losing its children. I appreciate that you're centering Faith's life in this conversation.
Yeah, listen, before we go deeper, a quick note on language. We'll be discussing violence, sexual assault, and forensic evidence. I'll try to be measured, factual, and respectful, and I'll flag moments where the material is especially difficult. If you need to step away, that's okay. Leela, can we start with who Faith was? Not the headline, but her life?
Absolutely. Faith was born September 26, 1992, in Warren County, North Carolina. She was a member of the Hollywood-Saponi, a state-recognized tribe in the region. Her mother, Connie, and her family raised her in Hollister and Warrenton. From what people who knew her have said, friends, family, classmates, she was ambitious and warm. She won a Gates Millennium Scholarship, which is a full ride. That's a life-changing award for someone from a small, working-class community.
She was, in many ways, the hope of the family. Connie named her Faith because she felt she needed, quote, faith to raise another child under really hard circumstances. Faith went to UNC Chapel Hill. She was an honor student, active in campus life, thinking about medicine or teaching. So she's not just another victim in a statistic. She was a student, a niece, a daughter, a sister, a young woman with plans.
Right. And I want listeners to hold that image. We too often begin with the violent end and forget the life. Faith was involved in her tribal community. She attended a native sorority rush event the night before she was killed, a moment that underlines how connected she was to her identity. That connection matters when we think about how communities respond to violence against Native women.
Exactly. All right, let's walk through the last 24 hours as precisely as we can. I want to pace this carefully. There's a lot of document detail, some of it sealed for a long time, some later released. We'll stick to what the public record shows. Thursday, September 6, 2012. Faith attends a rush event for Alpha Pi Omega that evening, later studies at Davis Library with her roommate, Corinna Rosario. They head back to their off-campus apartment at Hawthorne at the View around midnight, leave for a nightclub called The Thrill shortly after, arrive at the club around 12:40 a.m. Leela, anything you want to add before we keep the timeline?
Just that these moves are ordinary college moves. Library, then nightlife. Ordinary. That ordinariness is part of why this feels so jarring. Students go out. They come home late. We wouldn't, in 1,000 other nights, imagine anything out of the ordinary. That context is important. Most violence happens in ordinary places. Keep going.
Okay. Late that night, or early the next morning, records and phone data show the last confirmed activity from Faith's phone around the club. They return to the apartment sometime later. At about 4:25 a.m., Rosario leaves the apartment. Her account and other records indicate she gets into a car with a friend, Jordan McCrary, and goes to another residence. She says Faith was asleep in her room and the door was left unlocked. Rosario then stays elsewhere until about 10:30 a.m. when she tries to get a ride back to the apartment because Faith isn't answering her phone. Marisol Rangel comes to get her. They return just before 11 a.m., and they find Faith unresponsive in her bedroom. They call 911.
That discovery point, it's wrenching. The public record describes Faith's body found partially covered, significant blood in the room, severe head trauma. Autopsy reports list blunt force trauma to the head as the cause of death, and there was evidence of sexual assault, DNA and semen recovered in the rape kit. I want to be careful and clear. This is what investigators reported, and it's painful to state, but it's critical to understanding the charges that would follow years later.
Yes, me too. I'll say bluntly, those are the forensic facts released in public documents. We're not going to sensationalize them. We'll say what they say. A violent death, sexual assault indicated by physical evidence, and a crime scene that investigators treated as a homicide scene. Now, and this is where the story gets more complex, 3 distinct pieces of physical evidence drew investigators' attention early on. A rum bottle that appears to have been used as a blunt instrument, a handwritten note on a takeout bag fragment with a terse message, and a male DNA profile recovered from the body and the scene. Leela, let's unpack each of these.
Start with the bottle. Investigators recovered an empty rum bottle, blood on it, and later a palm print that the police say linked to the male DNA profile they developed. Forensic analysts believe that bottle may have been the blunt object used to strike Faith multiple times. Now, of course, every case is a mosaic of traces, stains, prints, fibers, but that bottle became a central piece of the physical picture. It suggested a close-quarters, violent encounter.
The note is one of those details that haunted armchair investigators and journalists alike. A fragment of a white paper takeout bag, likely from a 24-hour restaurant near the club, with ballpoint pen writing that reads, in common transcripts, something like, "I'm not stupid, bitch, jealous." Spacing and punctuation vary in different documents. Simple words, sharp tone. For some people, it suggested a jealous fight, an accusation, a message left by someone in rage. For others, it was odd. Why is the bag unwritten on while the room had blood everywhere? How did this note get there? Did someone write it elsewhere? Was it written with the non-dominant hand to disguise handwriting? There's been no public, definitive handwriting match released by police. Lila?
The note is provocative, but it's ambiguous. Forensic handwriting analysts can make observations about pressure, stroke, and so on, but unless there's a direct match to another sample in evidence, a note can only suggest possibilities. It could reflect a moment of confrontation earlier, at the club, in the apartment, or it could have been planted or written in a different context entirely. The lack of blood on the paper relative to the room has been a sticking point in speculation. Some take it to mean it was written before the violence escalated or written someplace else and brought in later. Others argue that blood patterns are unpredictable. Small things change whether an object gets splattered. Others argue that blood patterns are unpredictable. Small things change whether an object gets splattered.
Right. And the third piece, the DNA, ultimately became the axis of the investigation for nearly a decade. Early on, police announced they had male DNA from the scene and that the FBI had built a profile. They tested hundreds of men, suspects, acquaintances, everyone they could, and came up empty. One early suspect who held public attention was Arik Jones, a former boyfriend of Karina Rosario, who'd allegedly been violent and had reportedly made threats toward Faith. He gave DNA and was excluded. That exclusion, and the fact that no match turned up for years, fueled a lot of frustration in the community. Leela, you've worked with investigators before. Why do cases get to this stalemate?
There are lots of reasons, Maya. DNA is powerful, but only if you have a reference sample or if relatives show up in databases. If the killer hasn't been arrested for another crime that generated a DNA profile, if they don't appear in criminal databases, and if they're not in the community of people investigators can test, the sample sits as an unknown. Add to that sealed records, limited resources, sometimes strained police-community relationships. It can stretch years. That's why the later use of genetic genealogy became a game-changer in many cold case files.
That's a good segue. But before we get there, let's talk about the immediate aftermath. The sealed records, the media pressure, and the community's frustration. From the beginning, Chapel Hill police, unusually, sealed a great deal of their warrants and investigative files, arguing that releasing them would compromise the case. For months, even the cause of death was not publicly confirmed by police. The family had to share that detail publicly. The Daily Tar Heel and other outlets petitioned judges to unseal records. In 2014, some documents were released: the 911 call, portions of warrants, the note, autopsy details, and that release created more questions for the public.
And that secrecy can have costs. On the one hand, investigators argue that publicizing every detail gives the killer a roadmap, helps them evade detection or undermine prosecution. On the other hand, family and community members feel shut out, suspicious, and left to online rumor mills. For many Native families, too, there's an added layer, a historical sense that their loved ones' cases get less attention. Faith's case receiving coverage from major outlets did help, but the sealed records still magnified mistrust. What did you hear from family reporting, Maya?
Connie Hedgepeth, Faith's mother, was persistent. She spoke publicly, asking people to keep Faith's memory alive and urging investigators not to forget. She also pushed back against online speculation that pointed fingers at friends. In interviews, she said she wanted answers, but she asked people to be careful about naming or vilifying those around Faith without proof. That plea for restraint got lost sometimes because the public hunger for answers fed alternative narratives: the voicemail, the 911 caller identity, the idea that someone close did something, the 911 call itself. Do you want to say something about its content and why it became controversial?
Yes. The 911 call, released in part in 2014, is emotionally raw. The caller is distraught, can barely answer the dispatcher's questions, cries, says Faith is not moving and there's blood. The controversy stems from voice identification debates. Officially, the caller was listed as Karina Rosario. Some analysts and reporters have suggested it might have been Marisol Rangel, or even that the caller spoke as if they were trying to protect themselves. It's important to underscore, in panic, people don't always speak clearly about names or chronology. I urge caution about leaping from a distressed voice to accusations. But I know that hasn't stopped speculation.
Right. And another disputed piece was a voicemail on a friend's phone, audio some private investigators enhanced and read as an argument with male and female voices, maybe even the names Rick and Rosie. Police said the voicemail was consistent with being recorded at the club earlier and that metadata supported that timeline. Independent analysts countered there are software and timestamp issues that can mislead, so you have two camps: the official investigators saying this is not critical, and armchair sleuths saying it's a smoking gun. Leela, how do you, as a scholar, see that divide?
It's a gulf that appears in many high-profile crimes. On the academic side, we apply standards: chain of custody, provenance of evidence, corroborating context. A voicemail can be compelling if it's authenticated, if timestamps are verified and matched to other logs, and if the content can be reliably transcribed. But the internet doesn't wait for that rigor. People want a story that fits a neat narrative. Lover spat, jealous attacker, local suspect. Real cases are messy. Evidence can point in multiple directions, and that's where responsible reporting and careful analysis have to push back on quick conclusions.
Okay, fast forward. After nearly 9 years of testing, interviews, and dead ends, investigators turned to investigative genetic genealogy, uploading crime scene DNA to databases to find distant relatives and build family trees. That led them to a man living in Durham, Miguel Enrique Salguero Olivares. Police arrested him on September 16, 2021. They announced that his DNA matched the male DNA from Faith's body and from the rum bottle, and that his palm print matched the print on the bottle. He was charged with first-degree murder. Later, prosecutors amended the indictment to add first-degree rape and burglary. Leela, talk to us about what the genealogy process means for investigations and for communities.
Genetic genealogy has been revolutionary. It allows investigators to trace suspects by finding DNA in public or commercial databases, then building family trees and narrowing to a likely individual. For families, it's relief when a suspect is arrested after years of not knowing. For privacy advocates and some communities, including many indigenous communities, it raises real ethical questions: consent, the use of familial data, how law enforcement accesses or utilizes consumer genetic databases. There are also racial dynamics. Databases overrepresent certain populations, and the method may work differently depending on the suspect's ancestry and how well represented their relatives are. It's complicated, and it deserves scrutiny, even as it provides leads.
And legally, too. Many jurisdictions have developed policies about what databases law enforcement can use and whether they must get warrants. North Carolina investigators eventually used it in this case and said it led them to Salguero Olivares. When they executed a search and arrested him, the family, Connie, said she cried tears of joy and relief that someone was finally in custody. That moment of relief is important. It doesn't erase the loss, but it matters. Leela, community reaction?
For Faith's Haliwa, Saponi, her tribe, and community, there was, understandably, a sense of cautious relief. For many Native families, it isn't just about one arrest, it's about recognition. A lot of families feel that even when a suspect is arrested, the narrative around their loved one can be reshaped in ways that don't center the victim's humanity. I think Connie's public grief and insistence on Faith's accomplishments helped steer the conversation back toward Faith as a person, not just a case file. But in the broader community, people also asked, why did it take 9 years? Where were the resources early on? Those questions are legitimate.
Legitimate and painful. I want to hit something else that listeners often ask: motive. Right now, public records don't show a clearly articulated motive tied to the accused. Investigators, historically, believed the killer was someone within Faith's wider social circle, or at least someone familiar with her routine. But how Miguel and Faith may have known each other, if at all, is not fully unpacked in public transcripts. Prosecutors have added charges that suggest they believe he broke into the apartment, raped, then killed Faith. But again, trial evidence is where motive, timeline, and what the state says actually happened will be tested. Leela, how do you counsel people to hold that uncertainty?
I tell people to hold grief and curiosity together. We all want narrative closure, a motive, a clear story, But criminal trials are where facts are tested against standards of proof. Until then, we should avoid the temptation to fill in blanks with speculation. That said, it's fair to examine systemic patterns. Violence against Native women is disproportionately high in the U.S., and many of those crimes are never solved. Faith's case intersects with that larger pattern, even if the details of her specific case are particular. So we can both demand answers in this instance and push on the systems that make some victims more vulnerable. Faith's case intersects with that larger pattern, even if the details of her specific case are particular. So we can both demand answers in this instance and push on the systems that make some victims more vulnerable.
That's such an important point. We can demand accountability here and also use this as a lens on structural violence. Now, a few of our listeners will want more granular detail about the evidence, the rum bottle, the palm print, the DNA. We'll be precise, but not lurid. Investigators say they matched DNA from the crime scene, semen, traces on the body, and DNA collected from the rum bottle to Salguero Olivares. They also say a palm print on the bottle matches him. Those are the forensic pillars of the arrest narrative. Defense teams often challenge chain of custody, the reliability of lab work, and how genealogy leads were used, so those debates are likely to play out in court. Leela, what kinds of challenges do you expect in the courtroom?
Expect challenges on several axes. First, the defense will likely question the genealogy methodology and whether the investigator's family tree work was thorough and lawful. They might ask about database consent. Second, they could challenge lab protocols. Were samples handled correctly? Is there contamination risk? Third, they'll examine witness recollection, timelines, who said what the roommates observed. And finally, they may emphasize the presumption of innocence, reminding jurors that the state bears the burden of proof. For community observers, it can feel like a slow revisitation of painful details, but these are the procedural bulwarks designed to ensure a fair trial.
Fair trial and fairness to the family are both necessary. I want to open this up to some of the unanswered questions that still really gnaw at me. And I'd like your thoughts, Leela. 1. How did such a violent attack happen in a multi-unit building without neighbor reports of a disturbance? 2. If Rosario left at 4:25 a.m. and the door was unlocked, how did the killer get in? 3. What exactly does the note mean? And 4. Who called 911, and why did identification get muddied? Those are the narrative gaps. Thoughts?
All good questions. On the noise issue, not every assault involves screaming. A surprise attack, a brief but brutal assault, or even people mistakenly thinking a disturbance is just typical college noise can all result in no neighbor complaints. Also, sound insulation varies in old buildings. On the unlocked door, too many young adults habitually leave doors unlocked, especially among trusted roommates. That creates opportunity. The note, we've discussed, is ambiguous. And on the caller identity, panic clouds memory. People may misidentify themselves, dispatchers sometimes press callers for names, friends on the scene might give one another's names to protect someone or because they're shaken. None of these gaps prove anything by themselves, but together they create a fog that courts and investigators must cut through.
I appreciate that. We also have to address how this case became, for many, a kind of public obsession. Forums, blogs, deep dives by independent reporters. Tom Gasparoli, for instance, did a lot of document analysis and public commentary, and some private investigators pursued the voicemail theory. How does that online amateur investigation affect families and formal investigations?
It's a double-edged sword. Online scrutiny can keep cases in the public eye, generate tips, and pressure authorities to act. But it also produces misinformation, hijacks grieving families, and can complicate prosecution by spreading rumors or tainting witnesses. For Indigenous families, online speculation can be particularly toxic because it sometimes draws on stereotypes or minimizes the victim's culture. Responsible, evidence-based journalism is different from rumor. That's why community leaders and family advocates often ask for restraint. Let investigators do their work, but demand transparency and accountability when secrecy becomes an obstacle to trust.
And that takes us to the broader contexts. Faith's death sits at the intersection of college safety, sexual violence, and the crisis of missing and murdered Indigenous women. Native women experience higher rates of homicide and sexual assault, and often their cases receive less attention or delayed justice. Faith's case has been high profile in part because she was a UNC student, which some advocates worry skewed the response compared to other Native victims. Leela, can you speak to that pattern?
Yes. MMIW is a national crisis. Native women face complex jurisdictional issues, tribal, state, and federal layers that can create gaps. Policing resources and attention vary. When a case involves a university student from a well-connected institution, it often gets more media attention. That visibility can help, but it also highlights painful inequities. Why did it take 9 years to identify a suspect here, while other cases remain cold forever? That comparison isn't to diminish this family's relief. It's to say we must interrogate why some communities get quicker answers and others do not.
Listeners often ask what they can do. They want to act beyond consuming the story. For those moved by Faith's story, what are constructive steps? Leela?
Support tribal advocacy groups and organizations that work on MMIW issues. Push for better policies on data access and victim support. Support campus safety programs that don't just criminalize, but also provide survivor resources. And, importantly, when cases are in the headlines, donate to verified family funds or community memorial efforts rather than amplifying unverified rumors. Demand accountability from agencies, not sensationalism.
Good, practical steps. Now I want to move to a quieter part of this episode, the human aftermath. The Hedgepeth family, the tribal community, UNC groups, they held vigils, they pushed for answers, they remembered Faith as someone who loved her tribe's history and wanted to become a doctor or teacher. Connie Hedgepeth's public voice has kept Faith present in the public imagination in a dignified way. Leela, you mentioned earlier that stories like Faith's can be reclaimed by families. What does that look like in practice?
Reclaiming means centering the victim's humanity, talking about their ambitions, their relationships, their community roles. It also means ensuring families have access to resources, counseling, legal support, and platforms to speak without being harassed. When communities hold vigils that are culturally rooted, tribal prayers, songs, and ceremonies, it helps the grieving process in ways mainstream memorials might not. In Faith's case, those cultural elements mattered intensely to her tribe.
I want us to pause for a moment. Faith was young. She was a first-generation college student on a scholarship that could have changed her whole family's trajectory. That's not just context. That's what she represented to the people who loved her. Okay, we're going to talk about the arrest and what it means for still unanswered. I want to be very clear. Miguel Enrique Salguero Olivares is accused. He is not convicted. The arrest in 2021 brought relief and a chance for a trial. It also raised new questions. Leela, what was significant about the prosecutorial decisions we saw after the arrest?
Two things stood out. One, prosecutors later amended the indictment to add burglary and sexual assault counts, signaling they intended to prove a forced entry and a sexual attack in addition to homicide. Two, the Durham DA announced she would not seek the death penalty. That latter decision is both legal and political. Many prosecutors are moving away from capital punishment for a variety of reasons. For the family, avoiding a death penalty fight can mean a quicker resolution and fewer appeals, though it's not the same as closure.
And for the public, this means we'll get an evidentiary record at trial that could clarify motive, timeline, and relationships, or it could raise new ambiguities. The trial process is where the macroscopic questions, what led to Faith's death, how did the accused get access, who else knew what, will be argued under oath. Until then, the ethically responsible move is to avoid drawing final conclusions. Lila, are there pitfalls you hope courts will avoid in this case?
A few. Courts should guard against the spectacle, turning Faith's personhood into fodder for sensational prosecution or defense theatrics. They should protect witnesses from online harassment driven by armchair investigations. They should ensure evidence like the genealogy methods and digital artifacts are presented transparently and verified by neutral experts. And they should allow the family to participate in ways that respect their culture without exposing them to unnecessary public scrutiny.
Those are important checks. All right, I want to pivot to the big chapter ender. What remains unanswered? We've touched on many of these, but for listeners who are keeping score, here's a compact list. First, the precise motive and the relationship, if any, between Faith and the accused. Second, the exact timeline between 4:25 a.m. and when Faith was found. Third, the context and authorship of the bag note. Fourth, the content and authenticity of the voicemail some analysts highlight. Fifth, why it took 9 years for the arrest, and whether structural reasons contributed to that delay. Leela, anything you'd add?
I'd add, we still need better answers about police transparency practices and whether those practices helped or hindered the investigation over time. It's a delicate balance between investigative secrecy and public accountability, and I hope this case leads to better protocols so families aren't left in the dark.
I share that hope. Before we close, I want to ask you something a bit more personal, Leela. You said at the top you follow this both as a scholar and as someone from a southeastern tribe. How do you hold both identities in a case like this?
I hold grief and method. As a person from a tribal community, my heart goes out to Connie, to Faith's family, to the Hallowasaponi. I think of the centuries of loss and the present patterns of violence. As a scholar, I try to be rigorous, separate what we know from what we hope, interrogate evidence, push for rights. Those two identities can be painful to reconcile, but they also drive me to demand better practices, more resources, and above all, humane treatment of victims and families.
Thank you, Lila. That duality, heart and rigor, is what we tried to bring to this episode. We'll continue to follow the case as it moves through the courts, and we'll keep asking questions the documents can answer. One last thing. Connie Hedgepeth said when a suspect was arrested that she felt tears of relief. That moment mattered. It doesn't mean the family is healed, and it doesn't settle the lingering questions. It does mean the criminal justice system is moving toward an evidentiary reckoning. If you want to learn more, we'll include public sources and a transcript on our website. If you are affected by violence, please contact local resources. We'll list hotlines and support organizations in the episode notes.
And to listeners, hold space for the human beings in these stories. Read responsibly, donate to verified funds if you want to help, and support organizations working on MMIW and campus safety. This case is a reminder of how fragile trust can be and how much work is left to do.
We're going to close with a moment for Faith. I want to read something simple about who she was. An honors student on a Gates Millennium Scholarship, involved in her tribal life, considering medicine or teaching, a young woman beloved by family and friends, more than a headline, more than a case file. Thank you, Leela, for being with me tonight. And thank you to our listeners for coming back to Still Unanswered. We'll keep listening, we'll keep asking, and we'll keep centering victims and families in the stories we tell. This is Maya Ellison. Take care of each other.
Thank you, Maya. Good night.
Credits. This episode of Still Unanswered was reported and hosted by Maya Ellison. Our guest was Dr. Leela Redbird. Producer and research assistants came from the show's team. Sources for this episode included public court documents, local reporting from WUNC and the Indie Week, archived police releases, and documents released to the media. If you're following the case, please check the latest court filings for current information. Cases evolve. If you want to reach out, email stillunanswered@podmail.org. Please be mindful. We will not engage with speculation about private individuals. Thanks for listening.